Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Data as Healthcare Providers' Lifeblood, Strategies to Manage, Optimize, and Monetize Data. I am Brian Zimmerman with Becker's Hospital Review. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We're looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. And at this time, it is now my pleasure to start things off by introducing our presenters. Srini Ganesan is a seasoned healthcare data practitioner with NTT Data Services and has been in the IT industry for close to 28 years, helping clients through data transformation initiatives. He's had the opportunity to lead various data initiatives within multiple industries like banking, finance, retail, and healthcare to help customers realize the true potential of data. Srini has played key leadership roles in the analytics area for Fortune 500 companies, managing global teams and delivering business value on strategic and transformative engagements. In his current role with NTT, he leads the strategy and solutions for analytics portfolio, delivering value out of data-driven initiatives for healthcare provider clients. Srini had the unique opportunity of leading two major R&D initiatives for NTT Data Services, building standard and repeatable frameworks for accelerating analytical solutions in the insurance and healthcare industry. Kirabel Frew is the head of business development and product strategy at Inference. Kirabel joined Inference from Lazard's healthcare M&A advisory practice, where he led cross-functional teams on buy-side and sell-side engagements, delivering broad strategic and financial advice to the board of directors and management teams of healthcare companies globally. Prior to Lazard, Kirabel was a founding scientist at SQZ Biotech, a clinical stage immuno-oncology company, and he holds a BS in chemistry and an MBA. Kim Jackson is a healthcare professional with 20 years experience in analytics, business intelligence, data warehousing, process improvement, consulting, and facilitating data analysis, statistics, data governance, and master data management. She is the Vice President of Business Analytics. Her accountabilities include clinical and supply chain analytics, business intelligence, performance analytics, and data science. Kim has a bachelor's in economics with an emphasis in statistics from the University of California, Irvine. She's a Six Sigma black belt as well. At this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Srini to begin today's presentation. Take it away.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining this session. So it's a very interesting topic we are going to cover today. And I would lay out what are the three subtopics we have for you to discuss in this session today. So I would kick off the session by talking about the life cycle of data from what healthcare organizations typically do when they actually take it down to the outcome. So before we talk about data as a business, we would touch upon the aspects of life cycle number one. And then we would have a Q&A session with Kim Jackson, who is a seasoned healthcare executive who would talk about some of the business use cases where data governance and quality is critical to it. Before we kind of hand it over to Kirabel to touch upon what providers are right now doing in the aspect of really taking data and treating that as an asset. So he would talk about some of the experience Inference has, particularly in the context of leveraging data for collaborations. So these are the three topics we're going to cover today. Next slide, please. So before we talk about the actual value and data as a business, this slide, I would want to cover that in the context of what healthcare organizations and providers in particular are going through in the aspect of their journey. So if you look at some of the steps that are laid out, and I think a lot of healthcare organizations would relate to it in the context of where they are, right? So I think essentially what the blue milestones talk about is in terms of the value they are deriving using data. Now, obviously, there are so many different capabilities and so many different aspects of, what they are looking at when they are relating to these maturity aspects, right? So essentially, it starts all the way from basic compliance and, being, able to provide for reporting and going into the next stage in terms of how the necessity aspect of setting up data governance before they can start driving insights in terms of the number 2 and number 3 maturity aspects. And what, as you see, from 3 to 4 is where actually it kind of takes a kind of a curve and kind of goes ahead in terms of the business being engaged a lot more with respect to deriving value out of the data. And interestingly, this is where data quality and data governance becomes a key aspect, driving, some of the hygiene aspects of how data can be leveraged for insights, business insights. And as you move further, it kind of gets more and more in terms of how data is actually used for decision making. And what you see in terms of the maturity in the number 5 is more in terms of how data is actionable and how data is put back to use for driving the optimization or driving some of the business imperatives which the business feels is important. So this basically relates to the maturity aspects of data and how data is realized. If you go to the next slide, please. So essentially, this kind of lays out some of the aspects of what providers are looking in terms of data as a lever, and I think this is all around digital front door solutions, or how they are really trying to get to the cusp in terms of looking at data to put that to use for very specifically patient kind of experience aspects, right? So, I mean, some of the statistics as you see here is like, one of them talks about how 77% of the patients kind of feel that it's important that they have control in terms of how they can really, kind of schedule appointments. Now, obviously, all of this is driven based on data which comes from EMR, but there's an aspect of how data is an integral part of this one. And similarly, more in terms of the consumerism push in terms of how digital health solutions, be it telehealth or how population health and some of those solutions are driven using data. So this essentially lays out some of the foundational aspects of how data is being leveraged beyond what I covered in the first slide in terms of data being used particularly for reporting and analytics. Can you move to the next slide, please? So this slide essentially captures what entity has been doing in this space. So interestingly, this is a survey that has been done with around 500 odd executives from various different organizations, and healthcare being one of them, one of the major segments. Now, this essentially lays out how and where the barriers are in terms of data being used as an asset. So I think when we looked at that maturity curve, right? So essentially, the responses what healthcare executives were able to provide was in the aspect of about 14% of healthcare providers being data leaders. Now, obviously, that essentially means that they are really taken the data to being more and more actionable. So that's the number one interesting aspect. And as you keep going down, definitely, they talk about some of the challenges, data silos being one of the bigger one. And I will touch upon that in another survey too, which we recently did, as part of another webinar session too. And as you see, the other imperatives being data literacy, and how a lot of the challenges lie around kind of improving data quality and really putting a kind of a framework and governance around it. So this is something which we came up with. So if you look at the contrast, right? So I think healthcare executives essentially kind of talked about 14% of them being data leaders. So there is still a lot of ground to be covered, and we will touch upon some of those aspects when we go to the next of the slides. Can you go to the next one, please? So I just want to relay back to what I started my discussion around and what really goes on with respect to data lifecycle. And I'm sure I think every industry has something similar going on in terms of how data gets generated, collected, and then how data is cleansed and eventually put to act, right? Now, here, as you see, everything on the right is more systemic in terms of, where data comes from. And as you see from the generate and collect, there are so many different sources, both internal and external, which providers actually wrangle with, before they can get to anything actionable. And if you look at the bottom of it and the cleanse, right? So I think the data quality is the one which is actually relating to the curve which we saw in the first slide in terms of how they really have to switch gears before data becomes available to the business, right? Because a big part of how that is done is getting assurance from the business that, hey, they are actually able to use that for their insights. And as you keep going to the left side of the circle, all of them is around how business is taking advantage of that. So I think, I already talked about how they're looking at things like gaps in care, or maybe they're doing any disease progression or risk stratification, or for population health, or for any of the operational use cases, be it in the context of, whether they want to use it for smart scheduling or whether it's for smart payment. And so that's basically where the actionable data comes in, in terms of using this data for personalized care, and then put that to use for the patient experience aspect of it. So this essentially covers the ecosystem of what we typically see in a healthcare provider ecosystem. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, here is something interesting I want to kind of add on to what I talked about in terms of the survey which Entity did, right? And this is something which we recently conducted through a focus group session too. And interestingly, if you see, the two big imperatives as we saw in the previous slide too, is kind of resonated here, right? One of them being data quality as one of the biggest impediments, where it is more around how the business actually is able to understand the process and what goes into it, and the literacy aspect of, how is data actually massaged, transformed before it is made available for usage. So these two were the biggest impediments which were called out as part of the survey. So this is basically one of the key aspects of the life cycle which I wanted to highlight, right? Because this is the turning point, because once you are able to overcome this particular hurdle, it goes on more in terms of how the business is empowered to actually leverage data. So this is basically where I want to transition now to the next slides.
Yes, thank you, Srini, for all that insightful information on maturity and life cycle. And now, Kim, I'd love to turn to you for some more information about data hygiene. So the first question I have for you is, how does data hygiene and quality affect healthcare providers in general?
Absolutely. So when people talk about data hygiene, they're talking about cleaning data, of course, just like if you were to clean yourself. The 4 categories that people really need is, do I have the wrong data? Is my data incomplete? Is it inconsistent? Do different sources say different things? Or is it non-conforming, meaning it's not in the format I expect? An example of that may be, I'm expecting a positive or negative result, and the result actually says, oh, go look in the chart. Right? That's not exactly what I'm looking for, and it's hard to use it in the long run. An example how we might use this is recently many people have to, report on HEDIS measures. Most of those measures is an attempt to fill care gaps. An example may be, did everyone get their flu shot? That's very relevant in this time. That's important, not only because we get paid better with our contracts if we complete this measure, but it also is community health, and it makes sure that our patients are healthy. But to measure that and have our providers really fill all those care gaps gets more complex because of all of the data silos. And data silos really have an effect on our data quality and our data hygiene. For example, these HEDIS measures are based on claims, how I get paid. But when a provider tries to fill the care gap, they're in the medical record, which is the clinical side. So I could either get my flu shot while I'm in the hospital, and then that won't come also always in the claim because I get paid for the entire health stay, or in the doctor's office, which is the preferred place because then I get a direct claim. What if I got my flu shot at Walgreens? I may not even provide that, or I may not even tell that to my provider. And even if I tell them, I don't have documentation in the claim, so I might not get credit for it. All these different conflicting information and not being able to have a full picture not only means that my compliance rate isn't fully accurate, but when the providers come and they see their ratings, they don't trust it as much because they're like, well, I know that patient had it because I talked to them, or they told me they had it in the hospital. So it really decreases the trust, and then people being providers are less likely to engage to really make progress and change the behaviors that are required.
Yeah, it sounds like these data silos are a real issue, sort of very specific to healthcare. And Kim, I'm wondering if we can dig a little bit deeper on some more challenges here. So what are the typical challenges around data governance within healthcare providers?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the largest areas is an evolving medical record. It's really important that we understand what the definitions are, that we have consistency in the information that we have. In a lab space, this is ever important. As the definitions, and we get more and more lab tests, if we're trying to judge how many positive tests we have or in a normal, we're not always have complete data because we've misgrouped lab tests. And there's so many, hundreds of thousands that happen. They're always evolving. And it takes a clinical expertise to tag them appropriate. And most healthcare organizations don't have the folks to tag them. Although there is a national standard of LOINC, you basically have to have someone from the lab always there tagging them. It can be a full-time job. And most of our medical records and the mechanisms and the machines that grade these each have a different test. They call it something else. The result is slightly different. So to keep track of that is an ever expanding, exponentially growing task. Every healthcare organization has to continue to grow, and most don't have the resources to manage it. So that again then leads to incomplete, inaccurate, or hard to read information, which then degrades the trust of the results that we have and then reduces compliance.
Yeah, it sounds like what we've done here and what you've given our listeners is really, you've laid out these challenges here. So I'm wondering if we can close out this portion before I turn it over to Curebell. Could you share some best practices based on your experience with health systems? How are folks working to push back against these challenges?
Yes, one of the most important things that we need to understand before you start any project is the maturity of that business unit to make changes, to understand what they're doing and whether they're ready to make these business changes, because you can have the best data ever, but if people aren't ready to use it, then it doesn't matter. I like to tell a story of probably one of my biggest business failures I ever had. So I was very excited. This was about, 15 years ago. We were going to do this ER tack time dashboard. It was real time. We had message-based information, so we had transactions to the flow in the ER, so we could tell how many people were in the waiting room, how many people were triaged, how many people were with their doctor, how many people were waiting for lab or x-rays, and how many people were waiting to be discharged. We had a big flow diagram up on a huge big screen team, real time. And we had graded how long you should wait in each area, and it was green, yellow, red, depending on each one. And we could measure this real time across the ER, even in different pods that they had. So you had the best data you could imagine. It also matched their transactional system, so we were able to tie out exactly. But in reality, the department was red. It was red in most of these little pods all of the time. And the response from the leader in that area was like, oh, goodness, Kim, it's red all the time. This is really annoying. How can it be so red? And so they turned the monitor off. And this was basically them saying they weren't ready to really face what needed to be done. And so because the red was so strong and they didn't like to be reminded that they weren't making the changes, they just refused to comply. Our leadership wasn't ready to attack that problem and to make sure that we made the changes that we were ready. And so therefore, the project just stopped, which is super, super unfortunate. So it had nothing to do with, bigger, better data isn't always enough. You have to have really the leadership commitment to keep people accountable, to keep them to understand that changes need to be made, because if we're not using our data, if we're not changing our process, there's really no point. So
yeah, I really appreciate you.
Accountable.
Oh, go ahead, Kim. You can finish up there.
Oh, I was just summarizing that the best practice, which is what your question was, I told you a failure, not a best practice, was understanding your priority, making sure you have leadership commitment, and not only that commitment, but when they find a result that they don't like, that's the whole point, to find an area to improve and to actually try new things and improve it.
For sure. And I know our audience really appreciates real life examples like those you just shared. So really appreciate it, Kim. And as a reminder to folks, if you have any questions for Kim or other presenters, you can type those into the Q&A box you see on your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So now that we've heard about maturity, lifecycle, and data governance, I would love to explore the topic of curation and quality of unstructured data. So Kirabel, will you walk us through how important it is for curation and quality, which is a gold mine of information, right? Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So thanks, Brian. To kind of get to that question, I would like to just give a bit of background. So to give some perspective, what numerous kind of leading medical centers, healthcare IT companies, and others would like to do is leverage the opportunity presented by the exponential rise in the digitization of healthcare data. So that's why our company was founded, and why kind of many other companies have been started and medical centers are kind of forming partnerships around. The underlying motive there being that significant strides in kind of healthcare innovation, whether it's clinical trial design and recruitment, understanding diseases or drug resistance at a molecular level, or drug discovery and development, it will all come from inferring insights from many different data types, so omics data, EHR data, images, and other types of structured and unstructured data, really breaking down the silos between different data sets. So the Mayo Clinic, which is obviously a leading medical center in the United States, acted on this opportunity by partnering with Inference in the beginning of this year. As part of this partnership, Inference received exclusive access and rights to all of Mayo's medical records for the next 12 years in the biopharma industry. So you can see some examples of the types of data on this slide, and these have obviously been meticulously collected in a longitudinal fashion for decades. So this data, together with Inference's software capabilities, which I'll discuss shortly, allow for kind of the longitudinal analysis of the patient journey at scale, from the time they're admitted into the Mayo Clinic through every test, diagnosis, treatment, outcome. So this patient data, together with our software, allow for analysis of diseases at a scale and depth that we think is really quite unprecedented and quite unique in our industry. So a core reason why Mayo went with Inference as its kind of first platform partner is in large part our commitment to safeguarding patient data. The key step in kind of safeguarding the data and ensuring patient privacy is de-identifying the healthcare record from the patients. So we've actually developed a proprietary approach to de-identifying clinical data, including unstructured clinical data that Mayo had examined by an independent auditor of de-identification software. And his feedback to the Mayo Clinic was that our de-identification approach actually set a new standard in the industry. And I think that gave Mayo increased confidence in Inference's platform. In addition to that, we actually implemented a federated approach to accessing this de-identified Mayo data, meaning patient data never actually leaves Mayo servers, which is actually quite unlike how most de-identified data is distributed today, where many copies of the patient data are created and distributed widely. And given the abundance of personal information online, on social media platforms, et cetera, that status quo approach to patient data management and distribution really runs the risk of potentially, being re-identified, which would obviously be catastrophic for patients, for any health system, and anybody that's kind of touching the data along the way. So we think that our kind of world-class approach to de-identification, together with federated access, really gave Mayo confidence that together we could leverage patient data in many new ways by enabling other parties to access it safely through Inference. Basically creating an ecosystem that Mayo had complete control over, immediately kind of extending the resources at hand to leverage patient data for improved insight into diseases, therapeutic regimens, et cetera. So now coming back to your question, Brian, another feature of our software that enables Mayo to leverage vast amounts of patient data is our augmented curation approach. So curating patient data, it involves integrating multiple data sources on a patient to essentially separate the noise from actionable information so that doctors and scientists can perform queries and analysis on large cohorts of patients or statistically significant cohorts of patients. Normally, you would hire an army of abstractors, usually nurses, which is expensive. It takes a lot of time, and frankly, it's just not scalable to hundreds of millions of patients across different diseases. And an example of the status quo and an innovator actually in the area of kind of creating these curated data sets is Flatiron Medicine. So their manual curation approach, they hired an army of mostly trained nurses to go through each and every patient record to build up a digital database of curated data in oncology alone. And what we've designed is an augmented curation approach where a handful of scientists manually curate patient records on a digital interface, which actually teaches state-of-the-art neural networks to curate these documents themselves in a matter of days. So this obviously exponentially increases the number and type of patient records we can curate, which really unlocks scalability across these types beyond just oncology. And obviously saves kind of a ton of time. You don't need as many personnel to do the same kind of process of curating this data. Our curation approach, and obviously we kind of tested up against nurses at the Mayo Clinic to see the quality, and today delivers the same quality of curated data as experienced nurses at the Mayo Clinic in a fraction of the time. And our partners, including at Mayo, are very excited about that. So our mission in collaborating with medical centers is really to unlock with our software and our R&D partners the opportunity that exists in the vast amounts of healthcare data that's stored at these medical centers, Mayo Clinic specifically, to further the mission of the medical center itself. So, we're able to develop new insights into disease evolution at a depth and scale that is currently impractical with clinical trials. We can create rich, analyzable data sets to improve everything from the way clinical trials are designed to how patients are recruited in clinical trials, to how patients are diagnosed and what they're prescribed, all the way down to how drugs are discovered and developed. So with that, happy to take any questions, Brian.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Kirbel, Kim, and Srini for sharing your expertise with our audience today. And we will now begin today's question and answer session. So as a final reminder here, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard, and we'll get started right away here. So first question I'll open up to the group. The attendee asks, spatial patient data is a particularly important aspect of the patient's record. What are important considerations involving patient location data?
I'll start. One of the struggles that we have with patient location data has to do with, that's probably one of the areas where you need the most mature platforms and they're IT-centric. So having an enterprise patient ID, meaning one record per patient, understanding where their address is, how it evolves, being able to transform that data to have the most accurate record is key. An area that we also concerned was because of HIPAA constraints, where you get that information and where you share it is key, and there's some legal ramifications around it. So understanding if I find that information from Facebook, can I use it? Can I use it in another area? other industries don't necessarily have that barrier. If they find the best information, they know they can use it and they can share it across their organization. Depending on our contracts, we may or may not be able to share it. We may or may not be able to use the information appropriately, and we have to ask the patients how we can use it. So for us to be able to use that information appropriately, we have to have all those considerations. People are using it internally for business processes, for CRM and marketing, and understanding barriers in transportation for patients to coming to their locations is key, and people are, and we're starting to use that more and more as an industry. But those are some of the struggles.
So, Kim, just to add to your point, one of the considerations is also how providers take advantage of data anonymization techniques, because that's very key to how this is handled too. I understand the consent and the privacy of the patient's data is very important, but definitely anonymization is something which I think a lot of providers are taking into consideration. I just wanted to share that in the context of a technique. That's all.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Srini and Kim, for
yeah.
Go ahead, Kim. So sorry.
And that's where those technologies come. So to do automation, then you have to have a proactive, when I'm entering a patient's address, have those reconciliations, have those error-reducing features right there up front. And so making sure they're embedded in your systems means you may have to purchase them and work with your vendors to make sure that that's the case. And that's the key work in that area.
Thank you so much, Kim. Srini as well for that, adding that clarification there. So the next question then, the attendee asks, do large healthcare systems respect and then use data sent to them from post-acute providers, skilled nursing facilities, home health, hospice, et cetera?
I'll tackle that one as well. I would say sometimes I wish more. Some of the struggles that we've had in that space is how do you incorporate it? Where would you, for example, if it's in a digestible format, we may use it in our EDWs, our enterprise data warehouses, and then use it to determine the quality of care that we're getting when we're transitioning from through continuity of care issues, which home health agency should we use, what's the best outcome that we have, what are the readmission rates between each home health and hospice. A lot of times that data is manually collected, and our care teams are using that for determining who they want to send their patients to. Sometimes we struggle because of availability anyways. So even if I want to send it to that SNF, is there enough room? Do the ambulances work back and forth? So there's a lot of logistics that happen. Our goal is to use it as much as we can. I would say that in most companies I've worked for, we struggle to integrate it into our electronic medical record for clear understanding for all caregivers. So there's an attempt to do it through HIE or other mechanisms. But I know that they at least use it in manual methods for contract review and helping determine who you work with the most.
Thank you for tackling that one also, Kim. And I'm throwing you another one. This one is addressed directly to you. So how critical are data management tools in driving governance, quality, lineage, and data knowledge capture sharing?
It depends on the subject. So when we talked about address, absolutely, right? That is within the workflow, and it's critical that it's in the workflow. And to do that, you need IT integration up front and to proactively stop data quality issues. Now, for some master data management, a lot of times that's just a crosswalk. So if you have a small number of systems, you can do it in your EDW and just do a small crosswalk, especially for things that don't change a lot. Admit source, where does the patient come from, state, things like that, things that don't evolve quickly. So that could be done with not a lot of expensive tools. These tools can be expensive, I don't want to quote a price, but Depending on the situation, it may be hard for small organizations to manage it. For fast-changing, large volumes, these tools become more and more important. Another area that's important to determine would be analytics definition, right? Documentation of what a metric means. A lot of people are using wikis to start out to understanding how much agreement that you have in a measure. That could be done on a simple web page. The more metrics you have, a lot of the BI tools that are around are embedding it more and more in their products. I know Click and Tableau and those are building a lot of the ground up scraping systems that we see coming about are nice and they're fairly reasonable. Top down, this is my measure and I'm going to define it across the organization. Sometimes takes a lot of documentation. It takes a lot of staff to maintain. And if people are engaged, it can become dusty shelfware. So you have to understand where that balance is to help. And if I use a political term that we've been hearing lately, very few measures in healthcare are super precedent, meaning that the definition is not argued. That's super, super important if you're going to make change, kind of like I was talking earlier. And so documenting a ton of measures that people are still arguing about that aren't a super precedent measure sometimes can cause even more angst because it creates, I guess, ammunition for people to argue. So I would say, defining what you're doing and how you're doing it is important. And knowing your maturity of whether are people even willing to write it down before I spend $1 million on a tool might be a great first step, as well as, like I said, in your EDW, just creating crosswalks and starting using those in the technology may be an inexpensive first start if your organization doesn't have a ton of money.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, it sounds very important to get those definitions set early on, make sure speaking the same language, really. For the next question, the attendee asked, I'll open this one up. I feel that healthcare organizations are eager to leverage AI machine learning without understanding or establishing the quality of data. What advice would you give to healthcare organizations willing to leverage AI and machine learning?
So, Brian, this is Srini. Can I go?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. And I think it all boils down to the definition of and the clarity of what they mean by AI and ML, right? Because it can mean a lot of things. One is more around, somebody might say an ML would just mean automation, right? Or somebody might just say, hey, it's for curation. I want to really understand data which I cannot really get to, right? Or it depends on the type of application they are looking for, right? So I think it's important to really relate that to an outcome before they actually venture into something like this, because otherwise it would become a very academic kind of experience, just going through the motion of saying that, I can apply AI and ML on my data, but not realizing that they have not really tied this to an outcome. So I think defining what that outcome could be like, and saying, hey, it helps in automation or it helps in something like an optimization for business process or something where I really need access to some unstructured data for really driving some clinical outcomes. So it all boils down to defining those outcomes and then working backwards and leveraging these technologies.
Thank you, Srini. And I want to stay with you for this next question as well. So the attendee asks, how does the data lifecycle relate to some of the business outcomes like value-based care?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, right? And if you really think from something like value-based care or any of those imperatives which is driven using data, right? I think the important aspect is, like if you take value-based care, for example, right? I think the driver being, hey, I want to really use my data for improving the quality of care for patient or the population I'm caring for, right? And at the same time, look at aspects of, how I can really manage my cost. So to me, I think the definition of tying those metrics to know how data is critical and how you can get to that data and kind of really defines the metrics around quality of care and cost of care is one of the direct ways in which you can actually do it, right? So I would say, like, either with quality measures or financial incentives, which actually drive improvement towards this would be one of the key steps towards leveraging a life cycle, for an example, for value-based care.
Thank you, Srini. And throwing another one your way here. So how intricately is the life cycle tied to trust in data, and how important is data quality?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, right, the curve in terms of the maturity of how data gets used only starts, taking a momentum when it is actionable and it's being used by the business, right? So I think the aspect of trust is the most important barrier which has to be overcome in terms of how data is kind of consolidated, how is it really transformed before it can put to use. So I think understanding that and having the business to really get on board to that is a very important part of how that is derived. So essentially, in the aspect of life cycle, that is the most difficult part in terms of making sure that you have assurances and the business is really able to trust the data and they understand the integrity for them to be able to use it.
Absolutely. Think you've done a good job pointing that out, and I think some comments from Kim too as well have talked about really being able to trust data. So Kirabel, I want to get you involved here. So the next question we have from an attendee is, how do you leverage patient data in R&D while keeping it safe?
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. So I think, as I mentioned, putting a kind of emphasis and prioritizing patient privacy. So we've done that by creating kind of a new standard in de-identification and implementing a federated approach to accessing the data. So the data actually never leaves the Mayo Clinic, which is, a kind of turning point for how patient data is managed in R&D, at least in how medical centers interact with pharma companies through inference. The other thing is creating partnerships with R&D organizations that really further the mission of the medical center. And they can do that by focusing on kind of cutting edge R&D that is clearly in the best interest of patients, which would, bring medicines to patients faster, or would fund R&D in otherwise understudied kind of diseases. And a third kind of important item would be, I think it helps to be an R&D focused organization oneself. We've certainly benefited from being an R&D focused organization at Inference. So, many of our scientists and engineers are able to wear multiple hats and, consider the kind of technical issues around patient data safety and governance, but also kind of understand, how that patient data can be leveraged in useful ways at R&D organizations. So I think those are, some of the points that in the recipe of keeping kind of a safe ecosystem that kind of allows for R&D to be moved forward.
Thank you, Kirabel. I think staying on this sort of theme of partnership here, I got one more question for you, and then we can turn it over to final thoughts from each of you. Kirabel, do you have any lessons learned on how providers can work with pharma companies to be successful?
Absolutely. I think something that at least we've certainly noticed and benefited from is I think medical centers stand to benefit from, for example, partnering with companies that understand the needs of the medical center. So the patients, the potential uses of the data, and also understand how to implement systems that establish and maintain data quality and safety. So, Empress, as an example, has taken a very holistic view of the life cycle of patient data, with kind of a focus on keeping patients first. And that has pushed us to, innovate on multiple fronts, including ensuring high data quality, as well as kind of appropriately coupling the data with AI and ML solutions. And partnering with an organization like Empress, as an example, allows medical centers to kind of stay focused on their mission. They're partnering with a company that has the same mission in mind, and they're allowing pharma companies access in an ecosystem that they control to do cutting edge R&D that's in the direct benefit to patients. And I think those things together allow for kind of a successful relationship for medical centers and pharma companies, but ultimately for patients. So I think those are the types of things that I think medical centers stand to benefit from focusing on.
Thank you so much, Kirbel. Any final thoughts for attendees today? And then Srini and Kim, we can hear from you as well. Kirbel, you want to kick us off with final thoughts?
Absolutely. I think, it's certainly a very exciting time. I think software today allows for different kind of points within the healthcare value chain to collaborate in ways that we're unable to, either because of conflict of interest issues or other kind of data safety issues that have existed, that have kind of and rightly so have existed for a very long time. And I think today there are kind of cutting edge approaches to data safety and novel approaches to curating data, to leveraging it in safe ecosystems that allow for medical centers to, extend resources beyond, what they have kind of on their balance sheets by partnering with organizations that, in prior times would have been hard to partner with. So happy to, speak to anyone that is interested in these types of collaborations for their medical center. And, thank you for attending, and look forward to continuing the discussion down the road.
Thank you, Kirbel. Srini, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of, talk about the journey of data-driven organization, I think there are three facets which just, kind of stick to me in my mind. One is definitely, I think, this path which healthcare organizations have to go through in terms of eliminating data silos, number one. The second one, definitely a lot of focus in terms of, improving data literacy and identifying resources for them to actually, kind of working as a data-driven organization, right? So so that key data functions can be supported. And the third one, importantly, is to really have the business buy-in and kind of have their, business areas to actually champion this cause where they're really using data for decision making. So these are the three, at least the takeaways which I can think of, taking the path of, healthcare organizations becoming data-driven organizations.
Thank you, Srini. And Kim, you want to round us off here?
Yeah, I don't think I could have said it better, so I'll let Srini's stand as is.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a really great presentation, and it's been great, asking these questions to each of you and engaging with you all. And thanks to our attendees as well. We had some great questions here. I also want to thank NTT Data for sponsoring today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.
Thank you.